All right, so this intro is going to be way off because I would normally say happy Friday, and this is streaming on a Friday most likely, but it's actually Monday because if you're watching this right now, I'm actually not live right now because I am off and baby number six is here, but I'm talking as though this is the future because the baby's not here right now. Anyway, like I said, I told you this was going to get all messed up. But this is another session of Learning Tech Talks where we are exploring the landscape of learning technology, cutting through the fluff and getting questions answered as you build out your digital ecosystem. And so today I'm joined by Vince Han. He's with Mobil Coach, and we're going to be talking about what do you think, Vince? Would you describe? We're going to be talking about chatbots for sure, but I don't think it's going to be limited to just chatbots themselves. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. Yeah, I think we'll touch on like our expectations about artificial intelligence and technology as a whole. Yeah, it's a fascinating topic.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's what I'm saying. I think sometimes people hear chatbot and they think very specifically what that is. And our goal with this is to actually broaden people's horizons, think a little bit differently about it, because I know I've had people say, "Oh, chatbots, those don't really work very well," or "I don't really like, and it's like, well, but how are you using them?" And that's going to be the goal we have, is broadening the horizons and getting some good use cases. But before we get into that, we've got to warm things up. We got to get people to know a little bit more about Vince, because I know Vince. We've had a couple conversations now, but everybody who ends up watching or listening to this, they may not know Vince. So let's start with the usual, which is, where are you in the world today? So Vince, where are you right now?
I'm right now in my offices in Provo, Utah, in the
Okay.
United States.
All right. All right. So where I'm just trying to think. I'm not super familiar with Utah. So in the spectrum of Utah, whereabouts is it?
Provo is about 40 miles, 45 miles south of Salt Lake City.
Okay. Okay.
And then we're like about 180 miles north of like Zion National Park
Okay.
here in
All right.
Utah.
All right. So is that a vacation spot for you?
Yeah, oh gosh, what I love about living in Provo is that an hour to the airport's not so bad, and
That's
is
not too
well
bad.
worth the trade-off because we can hop in the car, get down into the beautiful red rock of southern Utah, as well as the mountains here in northern Utah. So
Okay.
if
All
you
right.
love the outdoors, this is a wonderful place to be.
Well, and an hour from major transportation is not. I mean, that's completely feasible given how often are you really going, especially right now.
Good point.
All right. So then a second question before we get into the discussion is the icebreaker, a little bit more about Vince, a little bit to get to know you, because my location is the same it always is. I'm in Waukesha, Wisconsin, joined by my favorite house plant, Fred. But let's transition over into the icebreaker piece, which is Vince. When it comes to this whole working from home, remote work, where do you sit on this? Do you love working from home? If you could, would you rather be in the office? Is there a balance that really, is your preference? Where do you sit on that?
Yeah, I don't have strong feelings about it, mainly because I think I love my work. So no matter where I
Okay.
am, probably my biggest challenge is turning off work in my brain when I need to be. I have a home office. I'm fortunate to have a home office, and my commute to my office is just like 12 minutes.
Okay.
So I probably split my time 70-30, 70% being in the office, 30% working from home.
Okay.
And sometimes I'll change venues just if I need a change of scenery to, sometimes you need that, little kick in the pants to stay very effective. And so driving 12 minutes can do that sometimes. Other times, if I'm back to back to back, there's something nice about getting up, staying in your pajama bottoms, and just cranking away from home.
Oh, that is super funny. Speaking of, well, it's not pajama bottoms, but there is. I won't mention because he'll probably watch this and he'll know who I'm talking about. But I know an individual, not pajama bottoms, but he notoriously always wears shorts. He always wears shorts, but he's very professional from the waist up. And so it's always hilarious because there have been a few times where now I always call him out on it, because he'll stand up and you'll catch it, and I called him on it once. He was very embarrassed, but then now I always give him a hard time about, whether he's got pants or shorts on now. So anyway, like I said, I won't oust him, but I agree with you. The convenience of being able to just take a few steps, and get to it is nice. In terms of me, I've been in the office full time. I've been remote 100%. I've been hybrid. I've done kind of the mix. My personality, I actually really, really, really do best remotely. I actually, and some of it for me is just sheer efficiency. I have so much going on every minute I have. I'm very cautious of. So for me, even the time to get in the car and drive, when I worked at one of the offices was maybe 10 minutes up the road, and I didn't go in for any reason unless it really was do or die for me. So that's my setup. But like you, I'm fortunate to have a home office. I think that does make a big difference versus if you're sitting on a couch or kind of making yourself comfortable in a chair. That helps a lot.
Yeah, I will say that now, since we're breaking the ice, my primary passion outside of work and family is running. I'm a pretty serious
Okay.
weekend warrior runner, and so to try to get my workouts in, it's a lot easier to do when I'm working from home. If I can just quickly sneak out and get a run in, then come back, shower, and not have to commute. That's actually been a big, depending on how busy I am in the day, I'll take a look at my calendar, say, where am I going to get my run in? And if it means working from home, then I'll do that.
Okay. I like it. I like it. So I'm not a runner, but I'm big into lifting weights, and I do a little bit of cardio in between that. And so similar, I have a gym downstairs, and it just makes it so convenient because like you said, you look at your calendar and you go, where do I have enough of a gap that I can just jump up, go take a shower, and be back in between, and not try and pack it in somewhere else. So yet again, one of the reasons I enjoy it. But let's transition this over, because otherwise we're going to end up talking about working from home all the whole show, and then people go, I thought we were going to learn about chatbots. So we got to make sure that they get their episodes worth. But let's talk a little bit about your background in this, because when I was introduced to you, your background wasn't necessarily L&D in the traditional sense, like a lot of folks that maybe I interact with on a regular basis, which is why it was great to talk to you about it, because your specialty is this. So tell me a little bit. We've talked a little bit about, we know Vince likes to balance his work schedule from home, and that I know you've taken some trips, and I know now you're a runner. But professionally, what's been that journey that now you're leading Mobil Coach, but you're in the chatbot space? Where did that come from? Has that always been a point of interest?
Well, so I'm a serial entrepreneur. I guess you could say this. Mobil Coach is my seventh company that I've founded. They've all
Wow.
been technology companies. I have
Okay.
spent time on the venture side for a few years as well, when I was in Boston. So sort of this whole understanding early stage technology companies, coming up with this idea, let's disrupt this certain market or come up with some sort of innovation. How do you build it? How do you fund it? How do you navigate all the externalities? How do you recruit people? All those types of things I would say would be my core skill set.
Okay.
And I love it. I'm very risk tolerant. I guess you'd have to be if you're a serial
You
entrepreneur,
have to, I would imagine, with Stephen Company.
because it's very risky. And I founded Mobil Coach 8 years ago, which out of all my companies, this is the longest tenure that I've had
Okay.
in starting and building a company. And I'm just having a blast. And how I started Mobil Coach. So where I'm really curious, other than just the the core components of being a technology entrepreneur, of wanting to build technology, and for me primarily software, I'm also really passionate about behavior change and human
Okay.
psychology, and just overall,
Yeah.
how do you influence behavior and how do people make decisions. And I think
Which would
anyone
make
building.
sense that you would then intersect with learning
Yeah,
technology. So yeah, it makes perfect sense.
yeah, for sure. A lot of overlap there. And I think that uh, and anyone building software in particular has to be interested in these things, because anytime you have an idea and you say, I've got the perfect idea for an app, and people tell me that all the time, I've got this great app, or I've got this great software idea, and you build it, and then you watch human beings start interacting with it, you're like, wait a minute, you're not supposed to hit that button, you were supposed to hit that button, and you start scratching your head like, this isn't going as I thought it would go. It's all about human behavior and how they make decisions, and how unpredictable they can be. And so 8 years ago, I got really into fitness and health. I just mentioned I was a runner. I
Yeah.
was actually very overweight, and I got into a multiple year journey of learning how to get healthy. At my peak, I lost 70 pounds,
Wow.
and just got really interested in the role of technology and apps and helping me educate myself on diet, on exercise, on fitness, on the benefits of getting healthy. And so as I sort of scanned the landscape of fitness apps, what I realized was, a lot of these fitness apps, well-known fitness apps, got millions and millions of downloads. But when you really dug into it, so when I put my entrepreneur hat and did some
Yeah.
investigation, the number of people actually using those apps was really, really small. And in
Okay.
fact,
Okay.
the people using those apps, you could argue, didn't need them because they were already going to get
Because
fit.
they would have been doing it anyway.
Yeah, exactly. And so
Okay.
that got my
Okay.
mind into, well, for people who really need the help, it's so hard to break through the walls that we create in our minds and our hearts. What can break through that? And long story short, I thought the thesis was maybe a chatbot could break through. So
Okay.
that's how I started Mobil Coach.
Interesting. Well, what's funny is you were telling the story. I'm thinking, fitness, your fitness. I'm like, how is this going to come back around to chatbots type of a thing? But I see exactly your point, which is, I mean, it's like a lot of things. People have good intent, they get excited about something, and then they do it. But the actual sustainable behavior change of how do you actually get somebody to do that? So then, how do you describe? Because if somebody were to check out Mobil Coach, if you look at it, it's how do you describe it? So when somebody says, "Hey, you're the founder of Mobil Coach," what do you say to people that it is? I mean, obviously there's a chatbot element, but how do you describe the company itself and what it does?
Yeah, so I describe the company as a platform where any expert or a vested party can design a chatbot experience that's not, um, when most people think about chatbots, they think about their own experience as a consumer, where you go to a website and a chat window pops open, and you're trying to. A lot of
Yep.
times, you just want to get rid of it. It's a very
Yeah, you're trying to do something. This little thing
yeah,
comes up and goes like, "Hey, I want to help you with something." You're like, "Leave me alone. I was just looking at
exactly.
something."
And that's a very transactional experience, meaning
Okay.
if you do need some help, you ask a question and then you want it to go away. So that's not the vision behind Mobil Coach. The type of
Okay.
chatbots that we're interested in are chatbots that actually establish a relationship with your target audience, that interact with
Interesting.
you over time, not on a web widget on a website, but through some mobile channel like SMS or WhatsApp or Facebook or even Microsoft Teams, where the chatbot's initiating helpful hints or coaching or tips. And so there's a lot of use cases where if I've got a vested interest in a target audience and I want to teach them or influence their behavior or help them reach some sort of goal, and I've got that expertise, I can design sort of this journey where the chatbot's dripping reminders and nudges over a period of time that hopefully is nudging and influencing that behavior. And so our technology
Okay.
enables someone to do that.
Okay. So really, in many regards, if I'm playing, let me play this back to you, and then you tell me if I've got this right. But in many regards, you're kind of democratizing chatbot technology for potentially the masses in some regards, where you can say, hey, if you have an expertise and normally you would engage with somebody and you want to be able to basically amplify or magnify what you can do with that through technology, so you're not always the one having to do that, you could potentially help them build a chatbot to be able to support some of that, ultimately driving behavior change. Is that fair?
That is 100% correct, Christopher. And then, if you Google chatbot tools, a lot of the most common tools, like for example, Amazon has Amazon Lex, or Google has a chatbot engine called Dialogflow. It's quite technical, and so it's really not for the masses. They say that it is, but I'm a pretty technical guy, and
If
it's
the masses are a software developer, then yes, it's
yes.
for the masses.
That's right. And the idea there is that you just train it a little bit, give it some context, and then it will start just learning on its own and going and going and going. which is great. There's a lot of wonderful use cases for that type of sensibility. But to your point, in the way that you aptly describe what we do, there are a lot of people who want to design the programmatic, like being the program, almost being like the executive producer of the chatbot, to say, no, I actually know exactly when the chatbot should say what to a certain person. And so being able to easily program that without having a team of software developers in the way.
Okay. Okay. So I want to unpack this a bit because, again, that's a divergence in chatbot technology. And this, again, goes back to in the beginning, we said, I think sometimes people have this very narrow view of what a chatbot. Oh, well, a chatbot's just, like we said, a little widget that sits in the bottom of your browser window that annoys you. Well, that's a use for it, but there's also a lot more than that. But so I am curious because as you kind of think about some of this, like I said, I think a lot of people have sometimes a bit of a visceral reaction when they hear chatbots, depending on their experience. I'm curious where you've seen, and maybe you've even encountered people who have come to Mobil Coach and gone, hey, we want to build a chatbot. And you go, I don't know that that's the right use case. Are there any use cases that you encounter or you see people bump into where you go, I'm not 100% sure that's the best way to use it? And maybe it's not the right, that the use case is wrong, but maybe the way they're thinking about it is off, that you would guide people on that?
I think the most common use case that I encounter that describes that dynamic is when people have unrealistic expectations about what a computer can do. So, in other words, the way I describe that is,
so let's paint these guardrails then.
Yeah, that's right. Like if you go watch Iron Man and see how smart Jarvis is, and then all of a sudden say, "Hey, I want to build a Jarvis." That's Hollywood saying, "Hey, here's a computer that has some emotional intelligence." Computers today are a long way away from having the context to have an emotional, intelligent type of user experience, and so that's probably the number one thing where people want a computer to be smarter than they're capable of.
Okay. Okay. So then in that instance then, because I think that's one end where I could see people thinking, hey, this thing is basically like a superhuman that we just program and let go and it replaces a person. So it's not quite there yet. But to some degree, I've seen people have feedback where they've said, oh, chatbots really, I mean, they can really only do so very few things that really, unless you're asking basic, where do I find this? Where do I find that? It's really not capable of anything like that. So would you say that's too far the other way, where you'd say, well, you actually can go far beyond that. It's just not Jarvis.
Yeah, for sure. I think that, if those are the two guardrails, the answer is probably that the chatbot can do more than you think that it can, especially in today's sort of interoperable network where you can have a chatbot plug into your HRIS system, to see your CRM, to your LMS, and all of a sudden the chatbot can be really smart about someone's context, and you can program pretty personalized prompts for people that I think that can not only be automated but very effective. So, for example, imagine that you want to design a chatbot for a new hire onboarding user experience, and you want to measure the speed to someone's efficacy in their job. And maybe there's a benchmark there already.
It's a pretty reasonable use case, especially for a learning show.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So if all of a sudden the chatbot knew what your job function is, and knew who your mentors were, and knew what location you're in, knew something about your background, knew what your progress was in the LMS for the required courses of your new job, all of a sudden, I think anyone can sort of start brainstorming types of reminders and prompts that the chatbot could send you, like, hey, Vince, you're week 3. You finished 3 out of the 10 required courses. Here's the link to the next one. You're a little behind. And we have found, like the chatbot could even say, we have found that people most successful in the first 2 months would have been at course 6 by now. So, find some time to do it.
Okay.
I think
a little bit of like chatbot shaming in some regards.
If it works.
If it works. Okay. Well, so before we go too much further, though, because I think unpacking some of these possibilities, and again, I think one of the things you just hit on, which is what I really want to dig into more, is I really see this as being in how you think about it, because that example you just described, if you're just looking for a very robotic, oh, for onboarding, we could use a chatbot to literally just force feed people, go here this day, go here this day, go here this day. It can do that. It could do that as certain reminders on a schedule. But what you're talking about is a little bit more dynamic in terms of taking some of these other data points and saying, hey, like, let's dynamically make this thing do things. So it doesn't feel quite so robotic. It's actually adapting based on the data that it has, based on new data that's being given to it, things like that. But before we go there, let's talk about really, because you said this is more than just a chatbot, but we're also talking about the intersection of artificial intelligence and all these other components. Let's just talk a little bit about how does one of these things work, so that people who may not be as familiar with AI, we say AI, but AI is as wide as the ocean is deep. How does that come together to actually make a chatbot operate?
Yeah, so it's important to understand there are two fundamental ways to build a chatbot. The first I alluded to a little bit earlier with sort of these consumer-focused customer service chatbots that are enabled by Amazon or Google Dialogflow, where you're training it some context and it's just waiting for users to ask it questions and it'll get smarter over time. So that's the first bucket. If that's the type of chatbot that you want, you go to those sort of tools and you sort of train it to do that. The second bucket is a little bit more of the user experience I'm describing with the onboarding case, and that's called a programmatic or a rules-based chatbot, where instead of that sensibility, you want to just program the different rules and triggers of when you want your chatbot to send what message. And that's a different type of system that will require some authoring or some rules, decision tree based authoring that you would have to get your hands on to pull that type of chatbot off.
Okay. Well, and the second, so let me ask you this. What level of AI is involved in the second box? Because the first box, definitely there's some machine learning happening. We've got natural language understanding going on in terms of understanding what you're asking, contextualizing it, and then reaching back and kind of learning along the way. Bucket two, is it less complicated? Is that also one of the reasons you're able to democratize it more?
Yeah, I think that's fair. So there are rules, sort of decision tree tools that you could argue don't have any artificial intelligence unless you, under the umbrella of artificial intelligence, automation is included.
Yes.
There are some very simple free tools out there that do that. Our platform at Mobil Coach, I would say, is a little bit in the middle, where there's a lot of sophistication in being able to program simple algorithms that then have the ability to dynamically create messages within the context of those rules, to be able to talk with other systems and have some, a lot of background jobs happening and thinking all the time. But simply put, yes, the rules-based is more human programmed than the first kind.
Okay, but you're dancing in the middle, though, where a true, just purely, and like I said, it'd be a very liberal application of AI. If we were to say automation in that category, true, just very general automation would be, hey, you program some rules, and if those triggers happen, if X do Y, if Y do Z, type of a thing. And that would be very basic. You're kind of in that middle ground of, yes, we're using some of that programmatic. You need to know, in essence, where you want some of these things to go and what events you want to happen. But it's also then combining some of this other information to make it more dynamic than just A, B, C. Yes?
Yeah. And it's interesting that, when we first started Mobil Coach and started understanding what was out there, and of course you want to have some competitive advantage and find your differentiators. And we have people asking us all the time, well, how much AI is in there? And so we try to insulate ourselves from doing it just for checking a box marketing and, really just trying to drive value. But, one thing I've learned, Christopher, is that for a lot of enterprises, they can't have artificial intelligence because one example is recently I've been involved with a project for a pharmaceutical company, highly regulated industry. They can't have a computer just making up messages. even if it's making up informed messages, they have to have every message of the chatbot pre-approved, FDA regulated, and so they need a programmatic element in order to, get the benefit out of the chatbot. So that's something that I did not anticipate, but has been really interesting as part of the learning process of figuring out what tools work for what type of company.
Well, and I think that I think a term that's out there is, kind of the black box of AI. That's very much a dangerous area for some companies, at least today, where they go, look, there are certain things that we just cannot hand over to a machine and just leave a machine to do its thing, because there are federal regulations or international regulations that prevent us from doing that, or even just liability things where, and I remember I got into this with a digital adoption platform years ago where I was dealing with federal regulation stuff. And the concern was, if the machine tells people to do this, we are liable for what happened because it was an automated response. A person was directed to do something, and we can't control that the machine told them to do that, but we are in control of that. And now this opens up liability. And it was one of those things where we had to say, whoa, we've actually got to cut back on our AI and automation, because this could actually put us in some serious hot water if we're not careful.
I think that it's useful for companies to understand that you have liability around the human employees that you have that represent your company. And a chatbot or any AI virtual persona is a virtual employee. And that doesn't excuse you from the liability.
No, you can't go, well, that was the chatbot's fault.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's not my problem anymore.
And this might be a tangent. You tell me if you don't want to go down this rabbit hole. But I was recently asked to write an article about ethics and artificial intelligence, and so I'm in the middle of doing all that research, and of course using my own experience. But you might have heard a couple of years ago of that self-driving car in Arizona that sadly struck and killed a pedestrian. And then you all of a sudden think about, okay, well, if a self-driving car is put in a situation where they see that an accident is inevitable and either person A or person B is going to get struck, how do they make that decision? And because a human's programming the algorithm brings up a lot of really interesting new sort of values that we have to grapple with and try to understand and learn.
Well, and I actually don't see this as a bad rabbit hole to go down, because I think while we can continue talking about the implications of chatbots, this actually does get into this whole, anybody who starts treading into this territory, you have to start dealing with the ethics and, in some regards, morality of where we're going with this. In fact, this is kind of weird to say because it'll be in the past when this is streamed, but right now it's in the future, because in a week and a half, I'm giving a keynote on the ethics of AI in this space, because there are a lot of considerations when you start doing this. And I think that self-driving car is a perfect one where you go, that is a really, really complicated thing. And to your point of machines don't have the empathy, there are certain elements that they're literally just, if X is 2 and Y is 3, well, then Y is the path that we take. And if Y happens to be, I run this person over because based on my equation, that is the best choice that I can make with the details that are given. There's no context necessarily built into that, and there's no way to do it.
Yeah, the few examples where people in the lab have tried to have computers learn on their own values has not ended well, where they end up being really poor experiences. So this is not easy.
Yeah, I think of the Twitter bot that went just.
That's right.
I mean, it just went off the rails in a matter of minutes.
Within 24 hours, they had to pull it. They had to. That's a great example. And then I was just reading another example where these computers were set up to compete with each other, and they quickly learned how to lie to each other. So.
Well, because again, there's not the, kind of, you think about the hippocampus and our ability to think about the consequences of what we're doing, and a machine doesn't have that. So it's just going to look at this is the best path to get to the outcome that we're driving towards, I'm not necessarily thinking about these other elements, and suddenly you've created a monster. Okay,
That's
so now that we've talked about the doom and gloom, apocalyptics of what can happen with this stuff, let's talk in real time, kind of from a practical standpoint. Because again, what are some areas where you say, hey, you know what? You might be able to, and again, we can keep this in the learning space, but I'm also curious what you're seeing with other customers where they're looking at things going, we hadn't really considered a chatbot for this before, but it's actually a really good opportunity for us to not even just automate, because a lot of times the conversations I'm in, they deal with, well, it's a cost cutting measure. We're reducing the number of people that we need to make these basic tasks happen. There's that, but I'm curious, what are some of these other areas where you've really seen orgs go, wow, we might be able to actually dramatically improve the user experience as well, not just reduce headcount to do it?
Yeah, I think that anytime your organization's having repetitive conversations. Now, repetitive does not mean bad. Repetitive could mean necessary. But
Okay.
if there are a lot of necessarily repetitive conversations happening, managers doing, goal setting with each of their direct reports. So times where you're onboarding people to new skills, to a learning curve, where you're trying to teach new information, when you're trying to provide some, in the moment of need type of performance support. These are all like wonderful and natural experiences where a chatbot can provide a more frictionless experience. So that's the first thing I'll say. The second thing I'll say is that there are some cases, not all cases, but there are some cases where people feel safer interacting with a chatbot during a learning experience. So I'll give you an example. So Christopher, let's say that you were my manager, and let's say we work for a company that is quite technical. We have quite a technical product.
Sure.
And you've walked me through a new product launch, and you've sat me down and said, here's our new product, here are the features, now go tell all your customers about it. And you say, hey, Vince, do you get it? I'm going to look at you and say, yeah, I get it. You're my manager. I'm not going to tell you I'm not getting it. I get it. But I don't really get it. And so I have found that in cases like that, people are much more likely to confide in a chatbot to say, can you walk me through that again? And so I think there are case dynamics like that where a chatbot's a fantastic tool to be able to help somebody.
So in that example, so let me ask you this though, because I actually read, it was recently a study on this, that one of the biggest things with chatbots, because to your point, I think sometimes people go, well, I never want to interact with a chatbot. And I would say, actually, that's not true. Actually, when done right, to your point, I think a lot of times people go, that worked pretty well. But I think one of the things that I have seen, you tell me if this aligns with what, you're in the space far more than I am, is that people want to know that that's what they're interacting with. They don't like the smoke and mirrors when you pretend it's a person on the other end, but it's actually a chatbot. Kind of that transparency into, I'm okay with interacting with a chatbot so long as I know it's a chatbot. And I've seen some of that with AI as well. People are okay with interacting with AI so long as the transparency that, hey, this is AI. We're not pretending it's a human and trying to trick you.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I think a few years ago, when chatbot technology was still much more of a novelty than it is today, I think people got caught up into creating funny avatars and trying to trick people. And of course, the Turing test has been around for decades, which sort of sets the wrong expectation. For those of you that don't know what the Turing test, it was developed in the 50s, where Alan Turing, a famous scientist, put computer developers to the challenge to say, can you trick an end user thinking that the computer is an actual human being? And that sort of set this sort of false expectation, I think, for a lot of chatbot developers. But today, the data is overwhelming where that doesn't really help you at all. So I agree to be transparent, to say this is a chatbot. And I think the number one design goal isn't can we make it ambiguous or not. The number one design goal is do the messages feel valuable? Period. End of story. the messages don't have to be even feel welcome. They could put pressure on me. They could make me shame, chatbot shaming. We joked earlier, but if there's value, people are going to respond to it.
Okay. Well, and what's interesting about this goes back to something that we talk a lot about in the learning industry. I don't know that we always get it right, but it's really about asking the questions, what are we trying to accomplish here? What are we really trying to accomplish? What does the end user really need? And then how can we use potentially a chatbot to accomplish what that is, versus the reverse of that is saying, we want a chatbot. Now let's go find a thing that we can wedge a chatbot into, and then we can say we did chatbots, versus saying, okay, we have this issue, whether it's, I even think of year-end performance reviews. You think of a lot of the behavior change that goes along with that. Did you ask other people about your direct reports performance? Have you had a chance to do some of these other things? Did you remember to put it in this system? Don't forget that. There's a lot of these things that are more just nudges or encouragements along the way that you need, that you don't necessarily need an actual person calling you to do that. But if it's relevant to what your job is, that would be tremendously helpful to somebody, versus getting that email that reminds you at the last minute, don't forget you have to do this, and you don't have any context to what you actually need to do.
Your comment reminds me of what I like to ask people when they're embarking on a chatbot project is like, okay, how are you going to know that your chatbot is successful? How are you going to measure that? And I think that's a wonderful question to frame the same sort of challenge that you just mentioned to people. Just don't do it just for the sake of, hey, we want a chatbot, we think that would be cool. So,
which is an actual conversation that happens frighteningly frequently.
Yes. Yeah. And so, the points that you were making in the performance review sort of journey, what data points do you have as an organization that already exist? What data points are you trying to improve and influence? Roll out your chatbot with that in mind, and design your chatbot with that in mind, and see if it moves the needle. And I think that's a great way to design whatever chatbot project that you're thinking about.
Okay. So let's get into this design piece, because I think this is actually an important piece, and actually ties well to what you're doing, which is trying to democratize this, and I would say this is where it's shifting. This used to be a pretty huge endeavor to have to go down this path, which a lot of times when you go down these paths, it was similar to when VR first started coming out, or AR, and they were massive investments. It was massive projects. And so nobody wanted to just gamble with, well, let's try something and see if it works. It was always this competition to say, we have to get this perfect and we have to get this right because we're doing so much, versus, it sounds like now the technology's reached a point where you can say, we don't need to eat the whole elephant or boil the ocean on this. Let's identify a few of these key pain points exist. You have the data to support what people really need in this moment is this. Let's inject that into the system and see if it fixes something. And if we need more or we need to change it, we can change it.
Yeah, and that last comment is just, it's a easily missed huge value of chatbots, where a chatbot, the user interface for a chatbot is just a conversation. You can put a chatbot on Microsoft Teams, on Zoom, on Google Chat, on SMS. People aren't having to download software, which means you're not having to write code to build a UI for people to download and to consume. And so that enables you to iterate a lot with chatbots. And so you can do A/B testing a lot. You can say, hey, we're going to try these nudges. We're going to try these reminders at 2 p.m. this week. And next week, we'll try them at 10 a.m. and just let's see if there's a difference. And so the ability to iterate and find sort of the sweet spot of your user experience design, let's put it that way, is so much more enhanced with a chatbot than traditional software. And so I think that people should start with baby steps. Start with an initial wave of messages. Get both the quantitative data in terms of, are people responding to it? Are they reading it? As well as the qualitative data, like, hey, are these messages helpful? What would be more helpful? And then you can implement that as you go, and very quickly get to a point where your chatbot's optimized.
So I'd love to just walk through just soup to nuts. Let's just say soup to nuts from beginning to end. If somebody's looking at considering this, walk me through, and I'll probably ask you questions along the way. How does something like this work? Because again, I think for people who may not be super technical, that could sound almost overly ambiguous, where you say, well, it doesn't actually, you can put it anywhere, and suddenly people go, I mean, how? Right? Like, how do you put it anywhere, or what? So, what does it actually look like in terms of, let's just start from the beginning. If somebody says, you know what, I think there are some opportunities, which, in my opinion, the answer is it shouldn't be, are there opportunities? The truth is, there are always opportunities for this, because if you look at any organization, any role, any company, anything you're trying to do, there are low-hanging fruit everywhere of, we're trying to get this done, and good grief, we can't get people to do it for whatever reason. And a lot of times those reasons may be they don't know, or the timing's not right, or whatever. So from the start, what does this look like?
Yeah, so there are two major components in terms of like the nuts and bolts of it. The first
Okay.
is writing or designing what you want the chatbot to say, or in other words, writing a script. What's the chatbot script? And you don't have to be technical to do that. You just sort of need to, ask yourself, okay, if I could clone myself. So let's take another common use case I've seen in the learning space of training reinforcement. So let's say I'm a program manager for some active listening course that people are enrolling in. So I have some domain expertise. So if I could sit down and write a script that I could clone myself, and I was going to text every participant of my active listening course, and I had the time to text every single one, what would I say to them? When would I say that? And it's a function of simply writing that down. So that's the first bucket.
Okay. So in some regards, and I'm going to stop you there just so I can make sure I'm seeing this right. In some regards, it's almost this architecting of the conversation tree or the decision tree of, all right, if you could, in that example, whatever that is, regardless of whether that's a software rollout or a course that you're running or whatever, if I could have a conversation with someone on things that I knew consistently were areas that I would kind of guide or nudge or push people, what would that look like from a timing, and just kind of lay that out? Is that
Exactly.
reasonable?
Yep. Exactly. It's a decision tree. And the if then can be as simple as, when someone finishes this course, send them this thank you message. And 2 days later, send them this link to a video to remind themselves of what we talked about. Doesn't even have to be interactive. It can be interactive, but it can be just as simple as
But it doesn't have
calendaring. It doesn't have to be. Yeah. So I think anyone with any sort of domain expertise can come up and write a script. And so that's the main component. And you could argue the most important component.
Well, yeah, because that goes back to the relevance piece. Because if you don't get that part right, or you can automate and put it wherever people are, but if it's nudging you with stuff that is like the little thing that pops up on the website when you didn't want it, you're like, get out of the way. This is a nuisance.
Yep. And normally in that first exercise of creating that decision tree, typically the logic is not going to be super sophisticated. So you really don't need a really powerful, authoring tool just to schedule those things. Sometimes it can get more sophisticated, but typically it's pretty simple. And then the part where it's probably a little bit more of a black box to people, not probably, it is a black box to people, is how do you plug that in to the channel of choice? And so a lot of organizations say, hey, we're a Microsoft Teams shop. How do I get this chatbot on Microsoft Teams? Or how do I get it onto SMS? And that's where you need a technology tool like Mobil Coach or others that help you plug that in. And each channel has its own idiosyncrasies. So Microsoft Teams has its own rules of how a chatbot can be published on there and how it works on there. You can do it directly using the Azure suite. Azure suite has a bot services module, a little bit technical. So that's where it's a little bit of a black box. Putting out an SMS, you need some middleware to be able to send messages through the carriers. And so depending on what channel you want your chatbot to live, there's some research that you have to do and some tool that you'll need in order to enable that. A platform like Mobil Coach, that's where we try to add value, where we're already plugged in with about 20 different channels. And so
Okay.
a big benefit of that our clients like about Mobile Coach is that they can design their decision tree in our platform and then turn on one or many of these channels right on our platform.
Okay. So in some regards, that's because now I'm just picturing this. So Mobile Coach in many places, it's playing as the authoring tool for this. Yes, is that fair to
Yes.
say? Hey, we're actually the authoring tool. So you could, in theory, go create this decision tree off on your own, and then you could hire an intern to sit on a phone and sit and text, you know, participants in a class and be like, "Here's your thing. Sit there, and every time text this, and if they respond with this, do it." Not the best use of a human resource, but you could do it.
Yes.
Then what you're saying is Mobile Coach then comes in and takes it. So that step, and I think that's kind of one of the takeaways from this, is that step is something that any organization could be starting to think about now. Is if and I think this goes back to, you'll hear this in the learning and development space a lot, where people go, we sometimes think about things as in terms of just an event. It's, oh well, we did this thing and it's an event. And what we're talking about is, what if you could take it beyond the event and have that support system in place to encourage, nudge, kind of drive somebody to continue carrying forward whatever that is. That thought process is something really anybody could start doing today to accelerate their programs. And then Mobile Coach, in essence, can kind of come in and say, great, you've done that work. Now let's help you actually pull this together in a way that now automates and pushes this out to people.
Yeah, it's been fun for me to watch. 8 years ago when we started Mobile Coach, we did almost immediately attract learning professionals to our very raw version of our platform back then. And back then, truly, most learning that I saw was an event, an in-person classroom, facilitator standing up in front of the room for a day or two. And now that's, well, because of the pandemic, of course, rarely happens. But even before the pandemic, we were seeing more spaced learning designs.
Yep.
And that lends itself a lot to this journey, this sort of storyboard of an architecture for what a chatbot could do to mirror whatever formal space learning events there might have. So I think it's a great complement.
Okay. Well, and I think, and again, I think one of the things where, and I've been in conversations where I've redirected this, because one of the initial reactions is, oh, well, we can get our systems to send out automated notifications to people on this. But there's a difference between what can feel like a personalized nudge that's a little more dynamic about who you are, that maybe knows your name, knows what you've accomplished so far, that can kind of make some recommendations along the way. Even I think back to the example in onboarding that says, hey, you've only done 4 of the 7 activities. Normally people in your role at this point would be at 7, and those who do actually show more success. Is there anything, we definitely encourage you. That's going to drive more behavior change then. Oh, I got another stupid automated email from the LMS and I'm just going to hit delete because I don't have time to go do that right now.
Yeah, and I think there's something very critically important about the conversational aspect of it. So, in North America, at least, most people, I just was looking at some stats, and I don't know the exact numbers, but this is going to be roughly close, where most adults have roughly about 60 apps on their smartphone. Christopher, I would be willing to bet that you have many more. But if you think about
reasonable guess,
yeah, just something. I have a hunch. But the number that we use on a daily basis is like 6 or 7 or 8, and all those app makers are thrilled. Like, oh, hey, we got Christopher to download our app. We have him. Not so true. And if you think about the efficacy of push notifications, which a lot of us have just learned to turn off, it's really hard to reach people. It's really hard to engage them. But through a conversation, through the same medium that I'm getting messages from colleagues or friends or family, if you can get into that sphere, then all of a sudden you just have a different level of access to somebody. Now, on one hand, with that level of access, it's very easy to abuse and it's very easy to annoy people if the message doesn't feel valuable. So the bar is much higher from a design perspective. But if you can check that box and have it feel valuable, you're just going to get unprecedented access to people, where those types of messages are going to make a huge difference.
Well, and I think the point you make there that is so important in this, if anybody's considering going down this path, and I would say this is true of anything, especially when you're dealing with people, is the intentionality behind it is so critical. Because yes, can you make a thing that just annoys people? Well, yeah, anybody can. I mean, anybody can design a thing that annoys people. I mean, you can turn on enough notifications in one of your systems to send daily reminders to people to the point that they're just frustrated and they block the email address. But that's not the right goal to have. Instead, it's to say, what might people actually be trying to accomplish, and spending a little bit of time of digging into why might they be struggling to accomplish that, so perhaps we can provide them with, maybe it's just encouragement. It might not be a resource. Maybe it's just the encouragement that, hey, you've done this, 5 days in a row, keep it up, here's what you can do to stay ahead of it. Things like that that might just be simple little tasks. I think sometimes we over engineer what can be the simplicity of conversations and dynamics between an individual.
Yeah, I appreciate that the word chatbot and technology and AI are intimidating. For a lot of people, immediately gets them like, oh, I can't do that. But that said, to me, the number one skill that's required in creating a successful chatbot experience is user empathy. It's writing, it's instructional design. Those things are far more important than whatever technology you're utilizing. And I think once people get started into these projects, they realize that pretty quickly.
Okay. Well, and I have to imagine there's a bit of a mindset shift, which even you brought up spaced learning as a good example. That's a mindset shift that, yes, you can chop up your 8-hour workshop into a bunch of micro nuggets and spread it out over 8 months. And it can be equally ineffective, if not even more frustrating, because now you've just said, well, really, like, now this isn't even enough for me to get anything out of it. Now you just annoy me over 2 months instead of for 8 hours a day. But that intentionality and mindset shift behind it to say, okay, let's think about what we're trying to do here. The same is true with a chatbot, where you would say, well, let's not just use a chatbot to shove more information in people's face because we think it's really important to them that they have this, but instead say, what is it that they may need? Now, are there any practices that you've seen organizations that do this? Are they just kind of gambling a little bit and taking some good guesses and then iterating and adapting very quickly? How are they getting to know what that right level of, well, we should be close enough to do it well before we go forward? I'm just curious how people are doing that.
Yeah, I tell people that anecdotally, my guess is that when someone, a professional L&D executive or program director, is designing their chatbot for the first time, based on their assumptions and their intuition and their knowledge of their audience, most of their assumptions are going to be right. Maybe 80% of their assumptions will be right, and then they'll be surprised by 20% of the things. And so that's where the iteration comes in. And so it doesn't take a lot before you're starting with a huge advantage, and it's not as hard as people might think it is. So it doesn't take a lot before you have that chatbot really in a place where you'd be happy with it.
Okay. Well, that's actually encouraging to hear, and should be for folks who may be thinking about this, because one of the things, and I will just tell you, that L&D often gets feedback for sometimes, is the fact that we can be a little slow to move on certain things, right? It's like, oh, hey, let's try and improve this program. Let's spend the next 9 months doing focus groups and employee listening tours and all this. But what you're saying is, for some of these things, especially given the fact that you can do this much more nimbly, you probably know 80% of the stuff, which is enough to put something together that you can put out there and then learn from it and get that other 20% fine-tuned and maybe tweak some of the 80% that you were close, but maybe you discover some things along the way.
Yeah, and I think the number one assumption that people find that they can have more patience with. So I think a lot of times L&D folks are given a challenge to say, okay, we want you to teach this much stuff to this audience, but we're only going to give you this much time. Yeah. So, then it becomes, oh, well, let's try to take advantage let's hook them up to a fire hose and just hope what sticks, which ends up being a very intimidating learning experience. And so with a chatbot, if you can be connected with a person over months or maybe even years, it affords you the patience to drip content at a pace where people can consume it more effectively. And I think that's probably the number one adjustment I see people like, oh, wait, we don't need to like force all this stuff in week one of the chatbot experience. We can actually wait and drip it in a much more friendly way.
Well, and I would say there's two things, and then I'll kind of wrap. I have one last question though I'm just curious about. But with this is, and this is something that I've been doing and have done with my teams over the years, is this is about kind of diversifying the designer's portfolio of what they can do. Because to your point, sometimes we've been limited to this, well, this is the options that we have, so this is just what we're going to do. And so when we first make that shift, we end up just trying to redo what we've done before, maybe in a different medium, instead of saying, hey, no, this actually opens up new opportunities to do things. So while, yes, you may have had to try and cram everything into the first week of onboarding because that's what you were limited to do, let's throw that rule out the window and say, what might people need if they could get it whenever they need it? And now you suddenly go, well, that could take a year. And you go, but that's not a limitation we're faced by anymore. So now let's think about how we pull these tools together to say, if that's what the best experience is, how do we thread together this suite of things to deliver that experience?
And that's one of the most rewarding things I have experienced with working with clients, is to see that creativity open up and to see people start brainstorming, the light bulbs going on, like, oh, wow, I can actually design a journey that, some of it's pushed and some of it's maybe pull. Some of it's directed by the learner and other things that I can direct. And it's just been really fun to see people who are much more creative than I just sort of design these chatbot journeys that are, not only effective, but can be really fun to participate in.
Okay. Well, and like I said, I think there's a lot that goes into that. There's the skill set, there's the mindset, there's a whole lot of different things. But one of the phrases that I throw around a lot, and I'm sure people who are around me a lot get sick of hearing it, is I'm always asking, like, what would we do if we could do anything? Let's forget, what our limitations, the bounds we've held ourselves to before, but let's blue sky this thing, and then we'll back into, well, what technologies might we have that allow us to do this? And again, I think chatbots can play a really important role in augmenting that. It doesn't have to replace some of the other things that you're doing, but instead more of an augmentation to how can we actually drive behavior change? Because that's really what our goal is as an L&D function. How do we change behavior towards performance?
Yeah. And for me, my blue sky is like, just when I think about what would I love in a chatbot to help me as a person at work, from a learning context, is to help me with blind spots, because I know that we all have blind spots along the way. How amazing would it be if a chatbot could help me see those, so I become unblind to them? And secondly, we all have moments where we get stuck, and if a chatbot could instantly unstick me, no matter however I'm stuck because something's broken or I can't figure it out, or I don't have enough time, and just all these sort of things. I think the possibilities are really interesting to have a chatbot help with those two things for me. And so I love this idea of blue sky, have people start blue skying, like, ideally, what would a chatbot do, and start working backwards from there. It's really exciting and fun. It's a fun mental exercise.
Cool. Well, again, we could probably keep going on this for a long time, and technically we're not live, so I actually probably could. But for your time and my time and anybody who's watching this down the road, I will pull us to a close here. But this has been, I think, a fantastic conversation that hopefully has given some people a different way to think about the possibilities when it comes to chatbots, and some of the things that you may be able to start thinking about and doing, even if you're not working with chatbots today, to start laying the groundwork and the framework for how you could layer this on and change your thinking about what the outcome could look like. It doesn't just have to be that annoying cable chatbot that you've asked for the 37th time. Yes, I've reset my router. Stop telling me to reset my route. We've all had that, and I think that's the experience, but that's not what it has to be.
That's you're spot on, Christopher. That's great.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the time, Vince. Thanks everybody for watching and listening. And hopefully this has added some value to your thinking, and have a great rest of your week.